Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. We have a very special guest tonight. We're going to be, an interview that I did earlier in the day with Michael Russell, the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution. But first, we are just going to run you down the headlines before we get to that interview. So we start, as we always do, with our coronavirus statistics update. And as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 453,077 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 433,472 were confirmed negative, 19,605 were positive. There are 71 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today, but again, there are no new reported deaths. This will, of course, be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will necessarily get tested, not everyone with symptoms will necessarily get tested. So we do urge you, though, if you are showing any symptoms at all, please do book a test as soon as you can. Of the people who have tested positive, there were 254 people in hospital last night, 2 of whom were in intensive care. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection stands now at 2,492. This number only includes those who have died in hospital, having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures available show that 41,405 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 2 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. Michel Barnier has accused the British government of wasting valuable time and warned that a post-Brexit deal between the EU and the UK looks unlikely. With 2 months to go until the EU-imposed deadline of October, the EU's chief negotiator said, "Frankly, I am disappointed and I am worried." Barnier added he was a little surprised because Boris Johnson had told EU leaders earlier this summer he wanted an outline deal by July. After 2 days of talks, Barnier said, "Too often this week it felt as if we were going backwards more than forwards." Jeremy Corbyn has revealed that he was briefed about the UK government's policy of letting COVID-19 spread widely in hopes of creating herd immunity. The former Labour leader told Grace Blakely on her A World to Win podcast that he was lectured at a Privy Council meeting on the idea and immediately replied that the plan was absurd and a eugenic formula. Corbyn said he agreed with scientists that thousands of lives were lost needlessly because of the herd immunity plan. The UK government has repeatedly denied that herd immunity was part of their original plan, despite the chief scientific officer and the Prime Minister himself describing the idea in media appearances early in the pandemic. COVID-19 tests should be compulsory for all university students and staff to prevent outbreaks on campuses and protect communities, according to an independent group of scientists. Testing should be carried out either before or as soon as people arrive on campus, with further tests conducted regularly, said the Independent SAGE Committee. The recommendation comes in a report published today that advises universities to provide online learning as the default rather than in-person teaching, noting the latter carried the most risk of transmission of coronavirus. A cross-party group of MPs is threatening to sue Boris Johnson unless he orders an independent investigation into Russian interference in recent UK elections and the 2016 Brexit vote. The MPs say the government's refusal to investigate Kremlin meddling is a breach of the European Convention on Human Rights, which enshrines the right to free elections in Article 3. The group says it will take the Prime Minister to court if he fails to implement what it describes as essential steps to protect future elections. It has sent him a pre-action letter, to which Downing Street has 2 weeks to respond. The wife of the Russian opposition figure, Alexei Navalny, has appealed directly to Vladimir Putin to allow her husband to be evacuated to a clinic in Germany to receive treatment for suspected poisoning. Doctors treating Navalny in the Siberian city of Omsk have refused to release him for evacuation to a clinic abroad, sparking a standoff with his family and aides who say his life is in danger if he remains in Russia. Crossrail, the mass transit train line through London, has been further delayed until 2022 and gone another £450 million over budget. Transport for London said that the temporary pause in construction and ensuing slowdown because of COVID-19 distancing requirements had only partially contributed to the latest delays, which means the Elizabeth line will open more than 3 years late and cost almost £4 billion more than originally budgeted. Funding to deploy low-carbon heat in existing social housing has been fast-tracked to support Scotland's economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. The vast majority of the investment made through the Social Housing Net Zero Heat Fund will be made in the coming year to support the start of construction on shovel-ready projects. It will also deliver a reduction in greenhouse emissions while reducing heating bills for social housing tenants by delivering a minimum of £20 million of investment through the Scottish Government's Low-Carbon Infrastructure Transition Programme. And finally, programmes to help raise the attainment of care-experienced young people are to benefit from £11.6 million of new funding. Projects as diverse as mentoring programmes and outdoor and play-based education were supported through the Care Experienced Children and Young People Fund last year. Funding was also used to provide looked-after children with laptops to support their home learning during the coronavirus pandemic. Local authorities will work with chief social workers and directors of education to decide how this year's funding will be used. Care experienced young people from birth up to the age of 26 are eligible for support. So that is all the headlines today, and now we do go to my interview with Michael Russell from earlier today. So I'm joined today by Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, Michael Russell. Michael, how are you doing today?
I'm absolutely fine. A nice day to be in Argyll, and I'm sure a nice day to be anywhere.
I'm sure it is. So we're here to talk about Brexit. This has been your portfolio, your responsibility, really ever since the Brexit vote. So speaking of quite broadly, how do you think the process has gone so far?
Well, I'll have done 4 years in the job next week, and I have to say it's become progressively more difficult and progressively more frustrating, and the advent of the Johnson administration has just made it particularly bad. I mean, today is perhaps a good day in a sense to talk about it, with yet another failed round of negotiations between the UK and the EU. It's partly a story of massive incompetence. It's partly a story of ideological fixation, which is quite clearly where we are now. The UK refusing to accept anything but actually a really bad deal, and putting themselves in a position where there is no possibility of anything but, the lowest of low deals, but going around as if they were masters of the universe. I mean, it would be laughable if it wasn't so tragic of what was taking place. The next round of talks isn't due, I think, to start until September. The entire period since the so-called high-level meeting in July has been utterly wasted, as we said it would be. And if there is a deal, and still I think likelihood there will be some sort of deal by the end of the year, it will be as bad as a no deal. The fact that that should have essentially what is the outcome after 4 years is tragic. It will cost us all very dearly. And the intention of the UK government, in my firm view, is to hide the disaster, the financial disaster of Brexit, under the financial disaster of COVID. Those are all things we need to get out of as quickly as possible, and that's why Scottish independence becomes more essential with every passing day.
And in 4 years, there have been 3 different prime ministers, 2 elections. What effect has that had, and how has the relationship between the Scottish Government and the Westminster governments changed during that period?
Well, I'm a great believer that you should never say things can't get any worse, because they will get worse the moment you say it. We had Theresa May and her inability to listen to anybody, but we had as her first Brexit Secretary David Davis, who wasn't an unreasonable man. He didn't really have much authority because May kept everything to herself, but you could have a conversation with him, and I did have conversations with him about a range of issues. He, of course, flounced off, and he was followed by Dominic Raab, who is not the most sympathetic individual, I have to say. But then we've had Damien Green, who was my opposite number. I got on well with him, and I have to say, of all of the individuals involved, I found him, very easy to talk to in terms of his recognition of what the problems were. Again, with Theresa May as Prime Minister, very hard to make any progress. David Lidington was a fair-minded man. I think, as Deputy Prime Minister, felt he was very constrained. But for example, on the no deal stuff, it's quite clear that you would have to work constructively in order to cope with no deal, even though it wasn't our fault. We would have to cope with it. I have to say, since Johnson was elected, things have just become progressively worse. There is in my view, I said in evidence to one of the parliamentary committees just this week, I think that Johnson is contemptuous of devolution. I think is a hostile agenda to devolution, and that is particularly run by Michael Gove, who I think is very difficult to have a constructive relationship with, because I think he regards himself as an expert on Scotland, and he wants to see the Scottish Tory Party dominant. Won't be, but that's his aim. And it's very difficult indeed. The joint ministerial committees are, by and large, pointless now. I have to go to represent Scotland's interests and to say what needs to happen. But it's a very, very low ebb, and there is no trust in the relationship whatsoever.
Now, I do want to come back to some of what you've said there, but right now the Scottish Government has to make preparations too. Where are we with that? Is there more legislation that still needs to be put through the Scottish Parliament?
Yes, there will be a substantial amount of secondary legislation that needs to go through the Parliament, but we're not getting the information about that we need to get from Westminster. I have, although the focus of the Scottish Government's work at the present is undoubtedly the pandemic, and has to be the pandemic, it's far from over. I have a group of civil servants working very closely on the issue of what happens now and preparing for the end of the year and the end of transition. And indeed, talk to the Cabinet about that this very week. We have a great deal to do, and every Cabinet Secretary and every part of the Scottish Government will have to prepare. The lack of information is really quite startling. If you take, for example, the implementation of the Northern Irish Protocol, there was a paper that the UK government issued last week, which started off with great enthusiasm. There would be no difficulty whatsoever. There would be an open border in Ireland. There would be no border down the Irish Sea. Till you get to page 50 or so, and then it all just disappears, because the reality is that there's a huge amount of work that will require to be done on moving goods from Scotland to Northern Ireland, and certain categories of goods will require inspection, no matter what the EU deal is, will require inspection. And there will have to be something happening at Cairnryan, either Cairnryan or in Ireland, probably at Cairnryan. And yet the UK government gave us 24 hours notice of that paper. And there's still no work being done to put in place the arrangements. So there's a huge set of things to be done, and it's going to be very, very difficult. We also saw the instructions to drug companies in the last week or so from the UK government, indicating that they should hold stocks. That indicates a concern about continuity of supply. There's no other reason for it. Now, in the coronavirus, in the work that we've done on the pandemic, we learned a lot from the planning for no deal, because we were able to understand and examine food chains, for example, for the first time that we've done that in a long time. So perhaps we are paradoxically better prepared than we were last year and the year before, but it's still not going to be easy, and it's still going to require an enormous amount of effort. And at a time when we're trying to cope with the worst pandemic in a century, and the worst economic collapse in more than that.
Well, obviously, you think the UK government is not as well prepared as it should be. A lot of the rhetoric that they've been putting out suggests that they would be quite happy with a no deal, like maybe that's actually their goal. What do you think is behind this lack of preparation? Is it ignorance or apathy?
I think it's both, but I think it's also ideology. It is myth-making. Bizarrely, I do think many of them believe the myth they have created, which is that there was a golden period in which the UK did not require any of the appurtenances of a modern state in terms of working with other states, and that it would be this extraordinary mantra, global Britain would be recreated, and everything's going to be fine because you'll be dealing with the United States with chlorinated chicken and things like that. It is all bonkers, actually. I mean, it just does not exist. It's very interesting to get confirmation that is what the problem is, and I think it lies in the internal market white paper. The internal market white paper has a strand, the one from the UK government that's presently being consulted on, has a strand running throughout it about how there's a continuity of approach, and that what the UK government is essentially proposing is to go back to what existed before the EU, and essentially what has been a system since 1707. This is nonsense. I mean, it's complete nonsense. What they are talking about never existed in the way that they say it existed. But they've drunk the Kool-Aid. They believe that it existed. And I think that's what we're also seeing on the Brexit stuff. They believe that there is that the EU has been holding them back, and that once they are free of that anchor upon their national ambition, everything will be fine. This is the first time, I think, in recorded history that a country has attempted to negotiate a worse trade deal than the one they have. And if you just pause and think about that for a moment, in order to do that, you would have to have some extraordinary field of gold in front of you that you could move into once you got rid of being in the EU. That doesn't exist. Nobody knows anything about it. So it's a fantasy, but it's a highly dangerous fantasy.
Now, you mentioned the internal market white paper, and obviously there was the debate on this in the Scottish Parliament this week. So for people who don't know, who've never really heard much about this, how would you explain these proposals?
It's a set of proposals that sets out to do two things. One, it means that the devolved governments cannot interfere in bad trade deals. So to go back to chlorinated chicken, if the UK decides that that's the only way to get a deal with the US, and it will be, then that can be imposed on Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland without their parliaments being able to stop that happening. And the second thing it's about is about hostility to devolution, and it's about making sure that the sovereign Westminster Parliament cannot be contradicted or gainsaid, even on areas of devolved competence. It's rolling back devolution. And the outcome of it will be very bad for Scottish consumers, for Scottish business, for all of us. It will be bad for every single person. And it is being rushed through. It has a month. There's a month to comment on it. In the middle of the summer, in the middle of a pandemic, there's a month. When now the Parliament is sitting, there's a month to consult on it. It is being rushed through because they want to get it over and done with, so that we can be put to one side. Now, the fascinating thing about this is not just that the Scottish Parliament rejected it by 92 votes to 31, which is 3/4 of the Parliament rejected it, and only the Tories stood up for it. Well, the Tories have one Liberal, and it should be noted that there is a Liberal, so-called Liberal, how you could be a Liberal and do this, who actually supports this. But the vast majority of the Parliament's against it. But interestingly, so are most of the organisations that have replied to the consultation in Scotland. There's one or two that have swallowed the Tory line. But organisations which are not normally critical of the UK government have said they're sceptical about this. Lots of organisations have said, hang on, this isn't really necessary. And they've also listened to the devolved governments which have said we don't accept there is a problem. We don't accept that there is this supposed problem about the internal market. But if there is any doubt about that and any difficulty, we've already agreed to put in place frameworks in a huge pile of areas which will take care of any difficulties. So there is a solution that can be put in place with no difficulty. Work's already been done on it. This is a power grab, and it's a deliberate power grab, and it's designed to undermine Scotland.
So how did this come about then? You mentioned this 4-week consultation, but there have been 4 years to prepare for Brexit. So why has this suddenly appeared now?
That's an interesting story. I don't think we know the full story yet, but the work on frameworks, which is designed to be the voluntary way in which we all work together, has been going on for 3 years. It's not been without its difficulties. We have consistently said we won't be forced to do anything, but we will work collaboratively with the UK, with Wales, with Northern Ireland. And the work is well underway. I mean, it's not finished, but I've made a commitment that we will behave as if it is finished, so there'll be no barriers put in place, and it can be put into place. But up until probably the end of 2018, that was fine. That was what was going to happen. And then the UK began to talk about something called they started, first of all, called it UK single market, though there is no such thing. And then they called it the UK internal market. And this was clearly an attempt from a number of individuals who were worried about devolution and the lessons of devolution, that they wanted Westminster to be able to force its way, to be able to veto anything that happened. And the lesson they took was the EU-Canadian trade deal. Now, that was successfully negotiated 2 years, well, it came to a conclusion 2 years ago. And there's two lessons you could take from it. One was the lesson I would take from it, which was when the Canadians put this together, the Canadians negotiated with the devolved with their provinces in the room. So the provinces that had certain things that were on the table were there helping to negotiate for them. So that meant at the end of the process, this could all be delivered. Now, that's the lesson the UK should have taken from it. They should have the devolved administrations in the room for all the trade deals, and they should respect the devolved competencies. But there's another lesson, and that's a lesson the UK took. And that's what happened at the end of the process when the treaty almost collapsed because one of the Belgian parliaments, one of the two Belgian parliaments, so the parliament of the Walloon Parliament, because of an issue. And it took up quite a lot of negotiation to make it happen. And the UK government is saying, don't let the devolved parliaments anywhere near trade deals. That's the lesson they've taken out of it. So that drove them to this position. We said in March 2019, this whole process is going to lead to an undermining of devolution. We're not taking part in it. I withdrew our officials from it and said, we're not going to take part in undermining devolution. Welsh continued to have the conversations, and I think they now see that, regrettably, I was right. And then the final part of this is the 2019 general election, where I think they got a fright. The Tories got a big fright with the SNP vote, and they decided that they were going to try and undermine Scotland. There's a strange association in the mind of Conservatives at the moment at Westminster between devolution and the SNP and independence. It's all in a mishmash. And they thought if they undermine devolution, that'll damage the SNP. And that's what they're doing. And one of the people deeply involved in this is a former Tory MP who lost his seat in Scotland, Luke Graham, who has been advising the Boris Johnson, and I understand he's been a player in this. Somebody who's not even elected is a player in this. But the outcome is quite clear, designed to undermine devolution, and we won't accept it. We simply won't accept it.
And do you think this display from the Westminster government is just contempt for Scotland, or is there some sense that by harming the devolution settlement, they can somehow hurt the SNP and or the movement towards independence?
As I say, I think there's a confusion in the minds of most Tories between devolution, independence, the SNP. There's no history in it. I mean, I was very struck when I gave evidence to the House of Commons the Public Accounts and Constitution Committee a couple of months ago. And I've given evidence to several times, but this was particularly interesting because this was the first time since the December election. The committee consists almost entirely of members who've been elected since 2015. Now, there are exceptions. David Mundell is a member, and so is a Welsh anti-devolution MP called David Jones, a former Welsh Assembly member briefly, former Brexit minister. But they're mostly younger or inexperienced MPs, and they really don't have any history of devolution at all. They don't understand devolution. They don't understand that there is no hierarchy of governments. There is only a hierarchy of parliaments. Devolution is a delicate dance around Westminster sovereignty. But they look at it and they say, why is this happening? And particularly if you're a Brexiteer, who believes in taking back control, to use the mantra, why are you allowing these people to make decisions? And in a sense, COVID has brought it into sharp relief because we have done things ourselves. We've trusted our own judgment. We've been very well led by the First Minister. And I think they look at this and saying, well, why aren't they just doing as they're told? So I think this is all mixed up in a strange sort of way. But there is also a contempt for the Scottish Parliament and a worry. I mean, if you are the party of the union and the union is flagging, you get worried. And it's bound up in Gove himself. I mean, Gove regards himself as essentially the arbiter of the Scottish Tory party, the person who makes things happen. He was clearly behind the ejection of Jackson Carlaw, one of the people behind it, and he must be worried.
Now, you mentioned there a lack of understanding of devolution, but devolution has been in place now for 21 years. Most politicians and civil servants can barely remember before devolution. So why are you finding so many people are so ignorant about the way the settlement works?
David Cameron had an interesting observation. He said that he thought one of the problems is that they've devolved and forgot. And that's probably true. Remember, devolution looks different from where you are. From where I am, it's a system, the SNP government has operated for the last 13 years and has existed for 21 years. We think it has constraints we'd like to do away with, but we understand not just how it works, but its history. If you're at Westminster, you don't really have to think about it, unless perhaps you're in the Treasury, where you deal with the Barnett formula. With most things, if it's devolved, it's not part of your consideration. And when your officials tell you, when you come into office on your first day, and they say you're in charge of the police, Priti Patel, but you're not in charge of the police in Scotland, you might start off by saying, well, why not? And they say because of devolution, and then you're not, so you don't think about it. Quite often you get mistakes made by the UK government, for example, about whether a matter is separately dealt with under Scots law, and they have to be reminded of that. But by and large, you could be a civil servant in a department that was either reserved or a department that was devolved and not deal with Scotland at all. And in those circumstances, I think it's ignorance. But I think it's also lack of thinking. If you're going to have a devolved system, you have to believe in it. They don't believe in it. They believe in Westminster sovereignty. Westminster sovereignty is medieval mumbo jumbo. I mean, it doesn't mean anything. But they believe in it. They believe that Westminster is sovereign and nobody can overrule it. And that also has made them Brexiteers, many of them, because they resent having to share and to work with others and be collaborative with others and accept there are other people on this planet. And it's a bit strange. You have to accept that in your own island too.
Now, you mentioned some issues affecting Northern Ireland. Obviously, that's quite a special case, but there are three different devolved governments with three sets of powers doing three different things around the UK. What's the reaction been from the other devolved governments and parliaments, and what's your relationship been like with them in terms of making your voices heard?
Well, broadly, it's a good relationship. We've worked well, certainly with the Welsh throughout this entire period. I mean, my opposite number was Mark Drakeford until he became Welsh First Minister. It's now Jeremy Miles, and we work closely together. So I think on this issue, there would be pretty much an agreement on it. There will be difference of emphasis. They're a Labour government, which supports devolution, where a nationalist government wishes to move on to independence. But broadly, there's an agreement upon this, and we agree that there should not be this legislation, and there should not be this approach. This on other issues, we will find much common cause with Northern Ireland, and often do, and with the entire executive, because the executive, of course, the two people that I work most often with are Arlene and Michelle, who represent Northern Ireland at the Joint Ministerial Committee. And there is, they take a position as a Northern Ireland executive, and that's right and proper that they do so. But there are also political traditions and strands within there. On this one, there is a very special arrangement through the protocol, which governs this. So they would not be as hostile to this as Wales and Scotland, largely because big bits of it don't affect them. They will have regulatory convergence with Ireland, with the Republic, and that will mean regulatory convergence with the EU. So they will have both full access to the EU market, and they will also have full access to the UK market. Although, as I said earlier, there are these barriers which Johnson says don't exist, but do exist. This will have, and they know this, and it's regrettable, but it's true. This will have some detrimental effect in Scotland. First of all, Scotland is the only part of these islands which is getting nothing out of the Brexit process. Northern Ireland voted to stay, and it's a special relationship. Quite rightly, we've never opposed that. Northern Ireland is in a special position, and we accept that. Wales voted in favour of Brexit, so therefore they are in a different position, though there's very strong opposition in some parts of Wales. England as a whole voted in favour of Brexit, but Scotland voted against Brexit by the largest majority of any part of these islands, and yet it's getting no special treatment at all, quite the reverse. So, in those circumstances, we feel particularly badly done to, and there are things in the protocol that may now be concerning. One of the bits of evidence on the internal market that's come is from one fishing organisation that has pointed out that there will be a pressure on certain types of fisheries to land within Northern Ireland and to access the EU market. So there may, in actual fact, rather than this white paper reducing barriers, there may in actual fact be new barriers coming in as a result of it.
Now, we've discussed some of the principled objections to these proposals, but what specific things are you worried about? Are there things that, for example, that this proposal could undo that are already in Scots law?
They are, in a sense, clever, or maybe the better word is sleek it, these proposals. Because what they do is they don't say any particular power can't be used in Scotland, but they render vast numbers of powers, one might argue almost all powers, useless. Because if they are exercised, they will have no effect. And I'll just tell you exactly how that works. Let's take this chlorinated chicken example. There's only one. We could take it in lots of other areas. And indeed, the white paper talks about areas that have never been subject to European regulation as being part of this, extraordinarily. I mean, building regulations is one that's mentioned, which has never been part of devolution, never been part of the EU. The building regulations have been separate in Scotland since time immemorial, yet that is included in this. Now, what the white paper does is establish two principles, which are established in European law. Mutual recognition and non-discrimination. But in European law, they're dealt with very proportionately. They sit on two other pillars, subsidiarity and proportionality. There's a huge amount of case law. They are not applied uniformly. They are set by negotiation amongst the member states, and there are huge amounts of local variation and ways in which they can't be applied. None of that's true. In the white paper, these are principles that are set in stone, which means if the UK Parliament decides on a food standard, let's say chlorinated chicken, probably using English votes for English laws without the involvement of Scottish members, then if that is a standard that is applied and a regulation that's applied in England, it must be recognised in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. So we could vote as a Scottish Parliament and say no chlorinated chicken. If you are the supplier of chlorinated chicken and it's allowed in England, you come to Scotland and you put it on the market and we say you're not allowed. You say, hang on a minute, mutual recognition, non-discrimination, I'm allowed to sell this here. And we say no, and they go to court and they win, because that is absolutely true. Mutual recognition, non-discrimination, they have to do so. Now that means that the powers that we have are pointless and meaningless in that regard. We can set any standard we want to set, but it will make no difference. Now, you can take that in chlorinated chicken, but let's take that in other areas. Let's take it in health service procurement. If we say no types of private procurement, certain types of private procurement in the health service, and an American company is allowed to do that in England, then they can come and we say no, and they say we're going to court, they go to court, and they're allowed to do so. And that would apply across the public sector, and it will apply across the private sector. And and that means it applies to almost everything. It's very difficult to think of an area in which it would not apply.
And you mentioned, Mike, discussing common frameworks to make things easier once we don't have the underpinnings of EU regulations anymore. Is there a chance that can still happen? And what is on the table now that could be put into practice if you had your way?
Well, they're there. I mean, by dint of very hard negotiation and a lot of work, we have 7 of them operable. There's another 20-something that are in the process of being made operable. We could make them operable within the next 6 to 9 months. A bit of work to be done in the Parliament. Even if it took longer than that, the commitment is there to do so, and we can certainly operate as if they were in place, and I've made that commitment. So that's there, that's available. You don't need to go through any of the legislative Westminster route. It's there and they would work. They would also be voluntary. There's a process by which the UK government reports on these, and upon the work that we're doing together, every 3 months that report is signed by, as it happens at the moment, Michael Gove. It specifies what has been done, and it also specifies that no compulsion has been used. We're happy to continue with that process. We don't like this, but we accept, while we're out of the EU and we want back into the EU, and that's where our focus is, but we accept during that time there needs to be at least a safety net We don't think it'll ever be used, but it needs to be a safety net. It's there. It's available.
Now, you've described how difficult the negotiations have been. Is there any resolution, do you think, that can come out of this that the Scottish Government can be satisfied with?
I proposed a resolution. It lies with the frameworks. They have to withdraw this proposal for legislation. They have to accept that we will work together on the frameworks. We all have to commit ourselves to ensuring that that happens. The weakness underpinning this is the lack of trust, and it is the lack of an intergovernmental relationship that is enforceable. There is, the joint ministerial committee structure is hopeless. I mean, everybody's known it since the start of devolution. Every report on it has said so. It can't bear any weight at all. There has been work going on for the last 2 and a bit years on a new intergovernmental process. It lumbers on. I do not have any great faith that it will ever come to a conclusion. The sticking block in it is the refusal of the UK to accept that we would work as equals, as equal partners. If that is accepted, then we can put in place a new set of relationships. They're not going to be permanent in my view, because I want to see independent, but they would be better than what we have. Those could go into place without difficulty. But the UK, unless it is prepared to accept that relationship of equality, then those will not happen. And the problem there is you can't put a dispute resolution procedure in place unless we're all treated fairly. And if one party to that in the end can just ignore it, then there's no point in having it.
You said, not surprisingly, that independence would be your ideal solution to this whole Gordian knot of problems. There have been more polls this week showing majority support for independence in Scotland. What do you think is driving that change?
There's a long-term trend. Independence, when I joined the SNP in 1974, was very much a minority pursuit. In the last 40 years, 50 years, has been growing, slowly but steadily, support for independence. So I think there's a long-term trend, and it is to do with a decline of Britishness, without a doubt. It is to do with an internationalisation of Scottish opinion. There's a lot of things to it. I mean, you could analyse why, the movement for devolution took so long, because it was interrupted, historically, by a number of events that reinforce solidarity, and then that solidarity weakens again, the weakening of institutions. All that's part of the historical analysis. I think in the last few years that has been influenced by the Brexit process, without a doubt, and increasingly by a hostility from the UK government, which is palpable to Scottish devolution and to the Scottish Parliament, and a lack of sympathy with what is taking place here. All those are factors which have led to it. And if you look at the analysis of polling, undoubtedly, the 2014 referendum and the arguments there that Scotland could not be in the EU, and then the people who told you that are now dragging you out of the EU, I think that's been an element too. Incidentally, that nonsensical position that Scotland could not be in the EU was repeated this very week in the Scottish Parliament by a Tory North East Scotland MP, who, they just repeat it as a mantra. It's just complete nonsense. But I think people remember that was used against Scotland and by the very people who are now telling you we're getting out of the EU so tough.
We saw a spike in support for independence just immediately after the Brexit vote, but that peak then kind of faded back down to roughly where we were in 2014. Do you think people just needed to see how bad things could get before they would think about changing their vote?
There may be an element of that, but Scotland is slow to change constitutionally. I mean, we know that it takes time for people to absorb change and to react to it. So I think there was an element of people being worried and frightened, and then thinking, maybe it won't be so bad. Remember, this thing has been going on, as I said, for 4 years, but I think it has got increasingly bad since Johnson became Prime Minister, and people have realised, first of all, how shatteringly incompetent the UK government is, but also how really against the Scottish Parliament they have become, and how ideologically fixated they have become. Things like refusing to take part in PPE procurement with the EU, driven by ideology, not by public health demand, is really worrying. And we see it again today. The collapse of yet another round of talks, with the UK demanding, things that they have no right to demand. They are the people who want to leave, but demanding things and all sorts of rhetoric that is deeply unhelpful. So I think people look at it and say, I really don't want to be part of that.
And now, judging from the behaviour of some UK ministers, some of the Scottish Tories, it does kind of appear that they don't care very much about how much they offend people in Scotland. What do you think is behind that mentality of claiming that their precious union is the most important thing in the world to them, but then doing so much that really turns people off the union?
I can't put myself in their shoes or in their minds. I mean, some of it is baffling to me too. I took part in the single market debate on Tuesday in the Parliament, and there was with some astonishment. I mean, there were contributions which you just thought, hang on a minute, do you really think this is doing you any good? I mean, if people want to watch it again on the parliamentary channel, I mean, look at Maurice Galton, who is a Tory, I think Central Scotland or East Mid Scotland and Fife. I'm not sure which MSP. His summing up for the Tories in debate is literally laughable. I mean, people were laughing at him, but he was sticking to it because, I suspect that you inhale your own rhetoric, and I think they've inhaled their own rhetoric on this, and they just keep going on the arguments, and they need to step back from it and say this is getting us nowhere. I mean, I don't mind that it's getting them nowhere. In fact, I'm quite glad it's getting them nowhere. But if I were a political consultant, I'd be looking at them and saying, "Hang on, I think you've got quite a lot wrong here." But I don't know the rest of it. I mean, it seems. I think one of the regrettable things is the bitterness of it quite often. I mean, I try not to fall into the swamp that is social media sometimes. I think social media can be very beneficial, but I think it can be very harmful too. But I see some extraordinary things from time to time from people who are utterly obsessed. And of course there are people on both sides like that, but some of the unionist stuff is really quite worrying. I mean, it is as if they are living in a different world and absolutely, having inhaled their own rhetoric, believe it to be true. And I think it's going to be very sad for them because in the end we all have to wake up to reality.
Now, there had been quite a bit of talk about an independence referendum happening in 2020. Now, obviously, that didn't happen because of the COVID pandemic. That kind of threw everything up in the air. But how close were we to having that independence referendum this year before the pandemic hit?
Well, I would very much like to have had a referendum in 2020. There is a mandate. I would like to have exercised that mandate. The first thing I did, first JMC meeting after the December 19 election, in London, I said to Gove to his face, I recognise that you now have a mandate to take the UK out of the EU. You must recognise that we have a mandate to hold a referendum on Scottish independence. That is, mutual recognition of mandates is an inevitability within democracy. I think the failure to do so says volumes about their inability to understand democracy. But we should pursue those issues. The pandemic has changed everything. It's not over by any manner of means. There is, we need to be very cautious, very careful at the present moment. Many of those who have been working on issues of independence and the Constitution are working on other things, and rightly so. But I regret there can't be one this year. But therefore, we must then focus on what happens next year.
You mentioned there the 2019 election. Do you think, in retrospect, that the Stop Brexit message that the SNP pushed during that election was a mistake, and that maybe instead you should have gone for a really unequivocal mandate to pursue independence?
No. All elections arise out of the circumstances of the time. The issue in 2019 and now remains Brexit. We were right to say stop Brexit. We still say stop Brexit. Brexit happened. Now we want to get back into the EU. But no, I mean, and clearly that was not a mistake in the sense that we took 48 seats. I think that probably indicates the sense of it, but also it adds to the argument and the process. And I would love independence to happen tomorrow. I mean, if I could find a way for independence to happen tomorrow, believe me, I would be there doing it. This is a process. It's a difficult process. It's a process we will we will have to keep working at, but I am confident that we will do it. There are two things that we require. One is determination, and the other one is unity.
And now, looking at the Holyrood election next year, the next chance that the people of Scotland can have their say about all of this, assuming that pro-independence parties do win a significant, convincing win, how quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months from the start of the process to the actual referendum. It depends how much preparation has been done beforehand. We have in place the Referendum Act now in Scotland. That's the equivalent of the English, well, the UK PROPERA, which is the structure by which you can hold a referendum. So that's in place. The new franchise arrangements are in place. So I would have thought you should set yourself the target of doing it within 6 months.
And what if Westminster still refuses to play ball? Keith Brown came on the show here a few weeks ago, and he suggested kind of an escalation of resistance of various kinds, right up to civil disobedience if that becomes necessary. Is that something that is kind of written on some little secret plan somewhere in SNP headquarters?
Well, what I want to say about that is I think we are, as we get closer to the election, we have to be very, very clear, both as a party and as a movement and as a nation, of what the outcome of that election will result in. Therefore, I think that's what I'm focused on, and making sure that we have say the right thing with the ability to deliver it. I am absolutely convinced that there will be a referendum because the people of Scotland want a referendum. And we shouldn't, Nicola has always made it clear that we should put beyond doubt any other issues, but we should also recognise that what happened in 2014 was the right way to do it. And in those circumstances, I do not believe that in any form of national life or politics, in the end, the will of the people does not prevail. And that's what we should plan for. But we should be able to say to people exactly what will happen, as a result of the electoral circumstances which we hope to bring about. And that's the right way to do it. But I'm not going to go into great detail about that here, because I think the right time to do that is as we build up towards the election. And that's what we should do. It is quite clear that the strategy of first of all, making it clear that we have a mandate. Secondly, making it clear that independence is essential. And thirdly, focusing, as we have to focus, on the immediate problems we face as a nation. And number one of those is coronavirus, is the right strategy. And that's what we need to take through.
And now for people who aren't SNP members, people who aren't going to be out on the streets campaigning for you during that election, what do you think people in the independence movement should be doing now?
We should be preparing. We should be campaign ready. We should be debating and discussing the good things about independence and how they are. And there are many of them, and there's a huge amount of material out there that allows us to do so. And the type of arguments and discussions we're having about the need for independence need to go on and need to be part of it. And the wider Yes movement brings to that a huge range of experiences and perspectives and constituencies, sectoral constituencies as well as physical constituencies in which these discussions can take place. And in my own way, I hope I can contribute to that by making sure that people understand the pitfalls and dangers of remaining in the existing relationship, the damage that is done there, and the prospects of something better.
Now, you said a bit earlier that you joined the SNP first in 1974, and now you're standing down at the election in 2019. I wonder, as you look back on your career, as I'm sure you have done, what are you most proud of?
Oh, I think the thing I'm most proud of having achieved, I haven't achieved yet, which is to be a part, whatever part I can be, of ensuring a successful choice of independence and a successful transition into independence. I'm 67 and I want to do some other things. I've got other ideas. I remember, I think it was Tony Benn who said that he was leaving Parliament in order to spend more time in politics. I'm not quite saying that, but there are issues I want to address. There's writing I want to do. People know that I'm an author and commentator. But I think we've still got unfinished business. So therefore, there's lots of things that I've enjoyed doing, and there's lots of things I'm glad I've done. I'm very lucky to have held a number of different ministerial portfolios. I presently have responsibility for external affairs and a number of other areas which are very important to me. But as a member of the SNP, I think and have thought since I joined the party that Scotland needs transformed, and the transformatory action is to achieve independence. And when we do that, then we put to full use the resources of Scotland, its people and its country. This is a matter of natural capital in a sense. And it's also, as somebody who represents a Highland MSP and has spent a great deal of my life within the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, the classic Highland problem was always how do you have the resources and abilities of the Highlands to the problems of the Highlands? Well, independence is that. How do you apply the resources, the skills, the abilities of Scotland to making Scotland a better place for everybody to live and to be part of a better world? And you do that by choosing independence, and you do that by choosing independence and being part of the EU and being a good global citizen as a small, wealthy, talented, well-educated country.
And again, looking back at everything you've done, are there things that you think you would have done differently if you had your time over?
A huge amount I would do differently. I'm not going to go into it all, but anybody who says to you, at any stage in their life, no, there's nothing much I would do differently, either isn't very imaginative or is very self-satisfied or has forgotten a lot. And
I guess finally, is there anything that you do still want to achieve before you step down?
Well, there's a lot of work still to do in the pandemic. I've been taking responsibility for the legislation, the regulations, and seeing those through, and therefore still a lot of work to be done there. Quite clearly, I want to carry on with the preparatory work on independence when we're able to do so, and bring that back on stream. I want to resist and to fight off these ridiculous and damaging proposals on the internal market. And I want to go on contributing to the success of the SNP government. I also want to make sure that I continue to serve my constituents as well as I can. Argyll and Bute is an enormous constituency. All constituency MSPs have been overwhelmed with work during the pandemic. There's a lot still to be done there. So all of those things will keep me reasonably busy, I think, for the next period. But I'm also also looking forward to having the freedom to do some other things.
And do you have any thoughts on what those other things might be yet?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts. In the fullness of time, I might come along and explain them to you. But presently, I'll just carry on with the work I'm doing.
Well, Mike, I can assure you there will be a thriving career in punditry here on Broadcasting Scotland for you whenever you wish to join us here. You'll be very, very welcome. So, Michael Russell, thank you very much for your time this evening. So that was my discussion with Michael Russell earlier today. I do hope some of that was interesting to you. We would like to thank Michael very much for his time. He has been a great supporter of Broadcasting Scotland for as long as we've been around. So we're very grateful to him for giving up his time to talk to us today. We're very grateful to you as well for joining us. And this is the bit, though, where we have to ask you to help us out. If you can afford it, please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month is what keeps Broadcasting Scotland afloat. So if you are able to help us out, then please do. If you're not, we absolutely do understand. We know times are very tough just now for a lot of people. If you're not able to afford it, don't worry. The shows will always be free to view online. You are still a very valued member of our audience. But you can still do as a wee turn. You can follow us on Facebook. You can find us there. You can find us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot. You can find our YouTube channel, subscribe there. Click the bell icon as well if you're already subscribed, just to make sure you're notified when we have a new show up. And then share the shows around. Let people know why you support Broadcasting Scotland, and hopefully they can become supporters too. And finally, as we always do ask, if you're interested in getting involved in TV production in any way, we have lots of opportunities here, whether that's as a journalist, whether it's working behind the cameras, working on the sound desk, whatever it is, there's lots of things you can do here at Broadcasting Scotland. So if you've got any interest in that, just let us know, and we would love to have you. But that is absolutely all we have time for today. So once again, thank you to Michael Russell for joining me. I'll be back on Sunday with the Full Scottish, but until then, have a great weekend. Goodbye.